Okay, today I have a real pleasure. I'm going to get to do one of my few multi-person interviews. I'm talking to a group called Ariadne, which they coached me very well on trying to figure it out. It seemed like we all came together to figure out how to pronounce it. And the two people I'm talking to is Ben Forrest and Christine Papania. Very interesting group. And instead of even trying to stumble through an explanation, I'm going to have them describe themselves. So with that, I turn it over to Ariadne. Ben, Christine, hey, good morning. How are you guys doing?
Good
Great,
morning.
great. Yeah, good morning.
So let's start off by having you describe yourself because your written descriptions are quite elegant and quite like confusing to me. So
Yeah.
I would like a bit of an explanation, please.
Yeah. So we have a couple different one-liners that that progressively, kind of go deeper into kind of what Ariadne is. We call it an audiovisual digital sacred music duo. So that's just kind of broadly from the music standpoint, it's a little bit easier, to narrow down. Like, although it's not super accurate, I would say it sounds like 16th century choral music with like noise and industrial.
Electronics.
Yeah. So like that's the music portion, but then there's also this visual portion. There's live generative visuals that happen in real time with the performance, and then we do audiovisual albums, and so that's sort of the visual side of things, and how they come together is always interesting, but.
They do.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I totally described that super well.
Well, I would say that there's a jumble of words there. I'm not sure. So I'll tell you what throws me because it's almost like I hit this word and it's like a speed bump for me and I struggle from there on. You describe your work as sacred work. And you've been nice enough to share some examples with me which are amazing. And you're right, this kind of like it really seems to echo ancient music, right?
Yep.
It's
Yeah.
it's amazing, but at the same time, what about it makes you describe it as sacred?
I would say from a music standpoint, I mean, and once we get into our backgrounds, I think you'll have a bit more understanding about that. But we both grew up singing in children's choir. I am a professional choral singer in New York, and most of my choral singing comes within the church with liturgical music and sacred music in that aspect. I think also art-wise, we're really drawn to that period of time. And I think that just comes out in our work, both musically and art.
Yeah. When we started this project, we didn't have a super specific goal, and it turned into a very specific goal. Christine was just kind of immersed in all of this sacred music. We didn't know that it would, but it heavily seeped into what we were doing. And yeah, and then we kind of took it from there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too because a lot of times when artists take on sort of like religious, whether it's iconography or soundscapes or whatever, they do so in a very critical or critique driven way.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the work that you do almost tends more to be an homage to sacred works rather than some sort of a critique of them. Now,
Totally.
I may have missed. Okay, well, good. I was hoping I hadn't
No,
completely
yes.
missed the mark, but it
No.
seemed like what you're doing is you're taking sort of the incredible emotions that are attached to those sounds
Yes.
and using that as kind of like the launch point for the rest of your work.
Totally. Totally. I think we never, ever want to be literal
Uh huh.
in anything that we do. Um, so I do feel like we take bits and pieces of the things that influence us.
Take me then through the process of saying, we have this at the heart of our work, but I'm also going to like take the bucket of glitch and pour some of that in, and I'm going to pour in some noise and I'm going to pour in some WebGL. How does that all come together in what you've got pulling this off?
Yeah, totally. I think just speaking musically, Ben and I met in college, and we were both in the conservatory at Indiana University in the music school. So we were within this really strict classical setting, but that's kind of when we started making music together. And so we were then always drawn to the underground experimental scene in Bloomington, Indiana. So I think from the very beginning, we were tapping into parts that weren't strictly classical, just from the musical standpoint. And then
Well, I think a lot of the aspects of, like, some of the, especially the harsher and darker aspects of both the visuals and the music, a lot of sacred music tends to be either or pretty or kind of just evoking this sort of beautiful image of the divine. But I feel like there's a lot more than just that. I think we enjoy discovering ways to talk about that with those darker textures and both sonically and visually.
Well, it does seem like spirituality always does have this mix of like a fascination with the dark too. It's almost like as wonderful as God is, Satan's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and Satan can be interesting, but God can be
scary too.
Can be scary,
terrifying
right?
too.
Yeah. Good point.
I don't know if you wanted to talk about kind of how the WebGL and all of the visual components sort of integrated into who Ariadne is, because it didn't always start out that way.
No, it basically started from wanting more control of how our music was presented. When we first started, we wanted like total control of the entire, not just the sound, but what you were looking at, even if it was just what we were probably thinking at that time, just a static image. What is visual is representing, us as our art. And neither of us were visual artists, and we didn't know anyone who could, help us kind of achieve that. So I kind of started figuring stuff out.
Interesting.
And that's how it's just kind of been that sort of process. Yeah, that progression of figuring stuff out so that we can have control.
Well, it seems though to make some sense, if for no other reason than, again, the music you're doing kind of steps outside the bounds of what would be typical, and so having kind of resting control of the environment that you experience, it makes sense. Now, you guys perform live, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I would assume, especially in that kind of circumstance, it's really valuable to say whatever the room is that I'm playing with, I'm going to transform it into a place that I can control.
Totally. And I think our music is so immersive that we just wanted an entire immersive experience. And with the visuals in a live setting, it really helps us achieve that. And maybe at one point, the visuals, when we were first creating them, had been secondary, but now they're totally equal with the music. We couldn't imagine it any other way.
No, yeah. And that happened pretty quickly. I mean, it went from visuals being a thing I was figuring out for, a couple months to, all right, this is a complete package and the visuals are equally as important.
What did you do sort of like from a self-training standpoint to make yourself feel, I guess what I think, and I've actually gotten drawn into doing visuals a lot too. And one of the things I felt like was there was a period where I had to become comfortable saying to myself that I was a visual artist, right?
Totally.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I feel like Ben sometimes still struggles with that actually, which is crazy with all the stuff he's done, but it's weird when you haven't had the proper training.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to say you're a visual artist.
Yeah. Well, especially and this is true for both of us. Growing up, like music was the thing that I did. Like that was my life, and art was something, visual art at least was something that I gave little thought to, hated art class, hated basically anything that didn't involve music. Even like right now, we're just finishing. Well, not just finishing, but we are in the crunch of finishing, this audiovisual album. So, I'm just working on visuals every day, and it's still like it still seems unnatural to even having spent 15 hours coding WebGL visuals to say that yes, I am a visual artist.
Well, and there's always the struggle with like the imposter syndrome too. You feel like, you're always worrying, well, am what I'm doing, is that too simplistic or too primitive? And one of the things I found out is that I had a really great experience working with dancers at one point, which was like, they wanted, some demos. So what I'd do is I'd put together like 20 different things and then we'd go through them all. And so I did some things that I liked, but seemed too simple. And then I'd work really hard on these really complex things. And I'd get in front of them and I'd do them all. And it'd be like, well, those complex ones were really cool, but that simple one, when we actually used it in the context of the total artwork, it just works so fabulously. And I was like, oh, geez, okay. So maybe I have to just shut down the damn editor every once in a while. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their backgrounds, and the combination of things that you guys do makes me really, really curious about where you're coming from. So could you tell me a little bit about your background, how you grew up, and how you became the artist that you are?
Yeah. One thing that's definitely common between both Christine and I is that we were both choir kids from very early on. We both sang in children's choirs. And for both of us, like singing and music was like our life. I mean, it was my life until my dad recorded my band's first album in high school. I learned about music technology. For me, grew up singing in choirs, singing in school. I guess another common thread for both of us is that we were also both theater kids, which I was at some point hesitant to always say, but I was talking with someone and they said that theater is the gateway drug for creatives in high school.
Right.
And I do feel like a lot of the drama of who Ariadne is definitely comes from our theater background, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, like we both brings, at least I'm finding from myself and just from others that's like a big part of what we do is the sort of like theatricality of it.
So I would say like you were definitely in the spotlight growing up, but then when you went to Indiana University,
as soon as my dad kind of turned me on to music technology, I went in super hard, and then I went to Indiana University for recording arts, what they called it, recording degree. The nice thing about the program is that you basically get trained on, recording orchestras and operas and ballets. So there's a lot of classical music recording. Mm-hmm. I had always participated in classical music, but that's what like really turned me on to that music.
But I think you also realized a lot of things about who you were as a person, having studied recording arts and recording others and editing other people's albums and other people's art.
Yeah, I mean, well, that took after college to figure out. And I feel like a lot of people who get into the technical side of things, it's hard to tell if you're the kind of person who wants to help others create or if you want to do the creating. And it took me a long time because I'm a technical person. So I love solving problems. So that part of it was really fulfilling to me. But it took me a long time to realize that doing my own creating was what was important.
Sure.
So that's, sort of the general thread for me.
Yeah. And so Ben talked a little bit about our backgrounds, but I always sang. I was always musical, children's choir, musical theater, all that stuff. And then I went to Indiana University, Jacobs School of Music for voice performance. And I did a lot of choral singing, and I did a lot in the Early Music Institute. So a lot of like Renaissance, Baroque music. Didn't do a lot of opera. Then Ben and I had also started making music in college. So I was composing and creating with our own project. And then we moved to Milwaukee, and I was singing in the opera company there. And Ariadne still wasn't a thing. We were basically working on this studio album, meticulously recording and editing, and sat on it for 2 years and then realized it was really bad. So we scrapped it, and I'm glad we did. And then we moved to New York about 4 years ago. And really when we moved here was when Ariadne started. And I don't think it would have started otherwise. Not to say New York was the end all be all, but for us, it really made us work in a different way, which I think was really good and exposed us to what was happening, exposed us to new media, which we had no idea what that was before moving here.
No, yeah. Well, and that album that we thankfully never put out is like the sort of genesis of Ariadne.
Yeah, I think we sat on this album, and the main thing for us was we just wanted to play shows, but we had no idea how we were going to bring this album to life. How were we actually going to play this live? Ariadne really started from in an improvisatory way. I mean, that's mainly what we do. We improvise every day, and much of our performances are very heavily improvised. And for us, that just opened up a completely new door.
Yeah, the album was through composed, and we were trying to figure out how to perform it, and there was no way to perform it without pushing play in some way. So that made me super frustrated because
that wasn't what you wanted to do. Yeah.
Well, exactly. No, and there's no excuse for someone who knows that you don't have to push play.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think for us, like being classical musicians, and, you know, it's so amazing to see a violinist play and a drummer actually play their instrument. And that's the struggle with electronic music is, for the most part, it's really boring to watch because buttons are really boring. But it's even more boring when it's actually not really live. And either the audience doesn't know or doesn't care, and the performer doesn't care. And I don't want to see someone sit behind a laptop and mix. Like, that's not why I'm going to see you, unless it's an amazing sound system. And that's why I'm there, to hear your record on a sound system. But for us, like, Ariadne started because we want to play our instruments. We want every sound we play to be live.
So
you can tell we're really passionate about that because electronic music can just be so boring, and it doesn't need to be.
Yeah. So what is it then in live performance that you do to provide that view of playing the instrument? Now, obviously, you're singing, which is a critical part of your work. But how are the electronic sounds produced or generated, and how are you juggling that with also controlling live visuals?
The music performance system came first. And it basically came out of, we figured out we couldn't perform our album, so we decided to do a 180 and, you know, just learn how to improvise. And we kind of just took 6 months and practiced a couple hours a day just improvising. And through that, I kind of built this performance system for solving the problem of performing with computers. We haven't fully solved it yet. There's still buttons, but one huge step is just figuring out a way, and I don't think it's that hard, to play with the laptop closed. You know, everyone knows what it looks like when someone's looking at a screen. It didn't want any of that connotation, and there's a couple problems that, you know, closing the laptop screen solves. You're not looking at a computer screen. But two, I mean, part of the problem with just creating with a digital tool is that, you know, potentially all possibilities are available. Which is, you know, a bad thing, at least for me. And I think for a lot of people, if you have a million choices, it's really difficult to make a decision. So closing the laptop screen narrows your choices to what controllers you have. Right now, we perform with, you know, the Ableton pushes, which are a nice expressive pad controller. But moving forward, we'd like to be using those less. And I've kind of been developing these electroacoustic based instruments using sort of machine learning to, you know, to be able to do physical gestures on a, you know, like a piece of wood or something more expressive, you know, multi-dimensional input for multi-dimensional output. I don't know if I totally explained that.
Yeah, so we have
perfectly.
Ableton pushes, and we also currently we have these spring-like instruments from a guy who's based in Texas. His company is called Electro Lobotomy. Is that right?
Yeah.
Of course it is.
Yeah. But it's really cool. So mine is like a bunch of rods and springs on this big wooden thing that kind of runs across my sternum on a little like guitar strap. I can pluck it, I can hit it, and it has a contact mic inside. But the coolest feature is Ben developed software so that I can run my voice through it and grab it in real time. So it's like a glitched out choir of myself that I sing over.
All right.
Yeah, and then it's the same with the push. I'm not doing any looping, but I'm actually grabbing my voice in real time, having a vocal phrase and playing that on my push in different octaves of a phrase maybe I just sang. So it's a choir of myself in real time that I can change on the fly.
Sure. I get it. So that's the whole music and sound system, which sounds like you already have about 6 arms worth of controls to deal with. How do you manage the visuals then?
Yeah, so thankfully I didn't have to develop them both at the same time.
Yeah. So we were touring with this performance system called Observance 003. And we were performing with it all last fall. And the reason we developed it was we applied to the Currents New Media Festival in New Mexico.
My favorite festival in the world.
Yeah.
I love that place.
So good. And that was in 2015. It was the first festival we ever applied to. We actually didn't really have everything all finished, but we were like, this is our proposal, and then we'll figure out how to do it.
I mean, we had all we had was a proposal. We basically we had done this audiovisual album, which was all this audio reactive
3D renders.
Not real time. The album was released on a micro SD card, that had the video files on it.
Took millions of hours to render.
Yeah.
Not fun as you're rendering on the road on tour. The album's already supposed to be done. This is just how we roll.
Nice.
Yeah. So that was, a super, I had never made a music video before, and then we tell ourselves we're going to make an audiovisual album. Yeah. Right. So our proposal for Currents was to, we'll make the visuals that we, made for this audiovisual album, but we'll do them in real time live. Mm-hmm. Basically, I used Touch Designer and figured out a way to basically make a visual performance system that requires very little input from me, so that we can be improvising and change musically, and the system will react accordingly. I only really I changed the scenes based on the mood. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the only input that it takes.
Yeah, so there were about 6 scenes designed for that, and the scenes can change based on the mood. And then within each scene, it always reacts in a different way, whether it's a cloth simulation or water, stuff like that will react in real time to the music.
I was going to ask, when you talk about being reactive, it's audio reactive to the music?
Yeah. So there's audio reactive light patterns that happen, and there's also there's a lot of physics simulations that are reacting in real time to different audio features. So if we're being really intense, no matter kind of what the scene, the visuals will be intense too, and conversely, if we're being calm and quiet, or if we're being silent, if we're silent, it should be black or near black.
Right.
So
you talk about how New York is what really kind of launched you forward with this. What were the influences of New York that really made a difference for you? What specific things really lit you up?
I don't know if that's entirely true what I said, but true in the fact that we finally felt like there was a community, and also there was an audience for Ariadne. So there were like-minded people. There were shows that we could play on that were appropriate. There were people that were going to come to those shows. And then just meeting other artists and musicians that really inspired us. And also there's just so many more shows to go to that I think we were very inspired in that way. But I would say the first tour we went on, we had only played 2 shows in New York. And then we decided to go on a tour. And yeah, that was crazy. But we randomly had emailed this experimental radio station in Chicago and asked them if they could help us with a show. The person that ran that radio station was John Cates, who is like new media guru.
Right.
And I feel like he was also a huge reason how we understood what it was we were even doing.
Yeah.
Before that, we really didn't know what like new media art was.
We found out through him that that's what we were doing.
Yeah, just a random turn of events. Also, like the singing that I do here, like I have a church job, so I sing choral music every week. I don't know. I think subconsciously a lot of things just like infiltrated our being that we weren't being exposed to before.
Yeah, for me at least, like I'd never really known the hustle in air quotes, until we came here. There's just a lot of people. I mean, not that there's not everywhere else, but it's good to be surrounded by people who are, working super hard.
Yeah, and I think that's what we needed right now. We're also both freelance, and I think that just allows us so much more time to create. Whereas, like beforehand, we were living in Milwaukee, and like both of us could have never figured out how to be freelance there.
Sure, right. Well, but I would say, if you'll permit me this, it also sounds to me like you guys are a bit of stress junkies too.
You are so right.
Because you're constantly putting yourself in fairly dangerous positions, pretty sure that you're going to be able to pull out of it before your nose hits the dirt, right? What?
Yeah, that's so funny, stress junkie.
Yeah,
I like that.
Well, what is it about that ends up? I mean, it seems like almost the antithesis of doing, this thoughtful, mindful, spiritual music on one hand, and on the other hand, like sweating bullets because you've got a bunch of rendering to do before you show up at the next gig. I mean, it seems like there's a conflict there that's hard to resolve.
Yes. You could say it's like the dumb part of us from college that still never learned that that's not a good way to operate in life. But
I disagree. It is a good way to operate.
Well, sometimes you should see us right now. I don't know. We're trying to do this web album.
Yeah. We're nosediving pretty hard right now.
I think that we wouldn't have done anything we're doing now if we didn't operate that way, because all of it seemed very unrealistic. We also don't like to sit on material for a while. So like the audio for our album was finished a long time ago, but I think both of us get really sick of things very quickly. So we want to put it out as soon as possible.
Right.
I mean, and maybe this is just how I or we operate, but to get stuff done, I need to put myself in a situation where it's do or die. And I think I have I'm definitely like very optimistic about these things, and then they turn out to be super hard, but we make it happen. I mean, we've definitely failed after putting ourselves in those situations, but like that's part of taking risks is taking on the potential of failure.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because one of the things I always feel like, and it's for my own practice, I feel embarrassed sometimes that I've put myself out there and I've really fallen flat, right?
Yeah.
And I look back at it and I was like, oh, well, it was because of this, or because, it was in this place that I hadn't considered, or it was, I was trying to do it on a nickel's worth of technology and it needed something bigger, or whatever, there was reasons for it I could understand after the fact, but it wasn't until I just literally jumped both feet into the fire that I knew if it was going to go that way or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you have to, you gotta, there's no, risk without reward. I don't know if that's the saying, but I mean, that's the way it's been for us, being comfortable with failure. I mean, that's, I feel like a thing that lots of people talk about, you gotta love failure, but I really try to, every time there's a failure, as long as I can figure out why it didn't work and make at least some sort of actionable steps to prevent that failure in the future.
Yeah, I mean, nobody likes failure,
it's good. Yeah, but it's good to look at it positively.
Mm-hmm.
So I like failure, except when it's embarrassing in front of an audience,
which has happened for sure.
Yeah, I know. I hear you.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the development of your end result. So it sounds like you actually have two sort of like results. One is the things necessary to put on a show.
Yeah.
And the other things, which are the things that are necessary to put out a release.
Yes.
And so it sounds to me like your releases that you work on the music, you develop music, and then you develop imagery to match it. That's pretty much right.
Yeah,
Have
yeah,
you ever
that's
done it?
yeah.
Have you ever done it the other way around? Worked on the imagery first?
We just recently did our first like visual only thing, but I've never done the visuals first, except for in the case, I guess you could say, the performance. You know, when I developed the visuals for the Currents New Media Festival, and then we toured with that for a year after. We had a general kind of sense of, for all this stuff, we have mutual influences and we're thinking about the same thing. And a lot of times not a lot of times, we always have sort of like a spine, like a general concept that we're going for. But I would say in observance, I developed the visuals, and then it's hard to say because it's improvised, but I know that we improvise differently with those visuals.
But for like an album studio recording, the music definitely informs the visuals.
Yeah,
what Ben creates visually comes from the lyrical content of the album and the mood of the album.
Now let's talk a little bit about that, because even there you kind of bifurcated the music part of it as being sort of like a lyrical setup as well as the coloring of it or the mood of it, right? Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, I don't interview a lot of people that do music that has lyrics on it, period. And so it's kind of interesting to talk about it because there are several different traditions in music that has words. There's sort of like the songwriter tradition where coming up with the words are then melded to music. Yeah. You come up with the words first, coming up with the right turn of phrase or whatever. There's other cases where the music is the driver and you come up with words to fit the music. And in even other cases, there's a conceptual umbrella that causes, that both the music and the words sort of like serve that. What is your mechanism and how do you meld those pieces together? And then what is the driving force behind the work that you do?
Improvising was something really, really new to me when I started. Like, as a classical singer, you never learn to improvise. It's totally different than jazz. So it's a very scary thing to do. But I always notice when I have fresh text, new text, I always improvise much better. So the text inspires me musically to improvise.
You should talk about how you improvise with lyrics, because that's like a weird thing.
Talking about that, even further, because it's hard to imagine. And again, going back to this sort of like split between, there being a music and the background mood and the thing. The first thing I imagine is like, well, you got some music and then you just like glurp words over it. But it sounds to me like maybe that's not how you do it at all.
So our live performances are always inspired by something we've been working on. So it's not just some random text. The text is always prepared, but so in a live context, I have text up and I cycle through that text depending on the mood of the music. So I don't use all of the text.
I have to tell you, I'm glad to hear that, because when you first said that, I was like, oh my God, I can imagine getting up there and if all you were thinking about is like, I have to pay a parking ticket. That would be a pretty devastating performance.
Oh my God.
And also like, that's why improv music has bad connotation, because I cannot get on board with improv music that is just indulgent BS, and like that is not
like
what
singing
we're
about. You have a parking ticket.
Yeah, that is not what we're doing. That's not what we're about. No, thank you. So in the live sense, that's what's happening. This new album that's coming out on October 27th, it's called Stabat Mater. And all of the text for that album was inspired by the visions from Christian female mystics, so like Hildegard von Bingen, Saint Teresa, and then fused together with this female dark surrealist poet. Her name is Åsa Berg, and her poetry is like super visceral and beautiful and grotesque. It's amazing. So that's how the text material formed for Stabat Mater. And so I had all of this text prepared. And when Ben and I wrote the album, when we were improvising and rehearsing together, I used that text, but sang it in an improv way. So use that text, but the music just came out.
Sure.
Yeah. We've said this before, but I think you made an interesting point how it's not, the lyrics are a thing added on top. But for us, I feel like at least just from an artistic inspiration standpoint, like,
that's where it starts.
Yeah. I mean, for us, it starts with literature and poetry. Right. And a lot of times, Christine obviously has the lyrics she's written out, but what we're trying to say, I feel like stems, is rooted in those lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it actually, it's like kind of the opposite. It's like the lyrics are sort of at least the words are, the foundational concept, and
right.
then everything springs from there.
So it's really not aimless.
Yeah, well, it sounds very organic. It sounds like it's growing.
Yes.
Like you're almost growing the tune based off of the seeds of this literature. That's really interesting.
And I don't think musically we ever would come up with the things we came up with if we were sitting down with pen and paper, and we would never write what we improvise.
Yeah.
Well, so given that you came from like this choral background,
mm-hmm.
how did you ever even allow yourselves to think to become composers? This is the thing I'm always curious about with people is, what did you do, or when was the point where you sort of gave yourself permission to be an improviser and to be a composer and to be, to take on these artworks that aren't necessarily naturally part of the thing you grow up doing?
Yes. And it's funny when you say composer too, because like that's my imposter syndrome. Like I wasn't formally trained as a composer. So it's funny that you said that.
Yeah, but all the famous classical composers were, I can't say all, but some good examples of, some of the best classical composers, Beethoven and Bach, were super well known for their improvisations. I mean, there's a quote about Beethoven, someone reviewing a concert that he did, and he just improvised a piece, and the guy was saying like everyone in the room was just weeping, and there's like this, I don't know if stigma is the right word, but there's this stereotype of the composer as having all this theory and having mapping the piece out in their head and then writing it down very precisely on a piece of sheet music. You can see in a lot of the scores that these things were improvised, or like based on improvisation. I don't think there's any need for imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
On that.
But the improv in general just started because we wrote that studio album that we couldn't perform, and we knew we had a lot to say, and we knew we wanted to play out. We knew we wanted to create music and play shows. So it really just started because we didn't have any material, and we were like, well, let's just rehearse. Like, let's just start playing something and see what happens. We had done that for a couple months, and then we played a show. And I remember I thought we had played for like 30 minutes, and we had only been up there 10 minutes. And I remember walking up terrified that I had no music prepared, because before that I was doing like singer-songwriter. I was playing the piano. Things were very mapped out.
Right.
And for this, it was so horrifying to me that I was walking up with like no agenda, like no plan of action. And we played for like 10 minutes, and I thought it was like eternity.
Right.
But to answer your question, for both of us, like feeling like composers, I think started with Ariadne, but I mean, I think Christine, you were writing your own music,
Mm-hmm.
As a solo voice before this stuff. So I think that started with you a lot earlier.
Yeah. And I think what's like still put me in the classical scene is that I really enjoy choral music. Like I enjoy collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's like just been why I'm still doing it. But sometimes it started to feel very unnatural to learn art songs and to sing arias and to be a voice for somebody else's music in a solo way and someone else's text that necessarily like it started to feel like it didn't really like speak to me, and I felt really phony.
Mm-hmm.
Unless I just really like, there are some pieces like I love Samuel Barber and I could sing all of his music, but there, not every composer is like that. And I think, I don't know, I just always wanted to create. I always wanted to write my own music to perform, because that to me felt the most honest and the way I could be the most musical with my instrument.
I think the start of this project was a realization point for both of us that we didn't want to be interpreters.
Yeah.
And we wanted to, have our own voice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unfortunately, we've already burned through all our time. I have a million questions, but I'll have to save them for another time.
All good.
What I do want to know is, so you will have just released this album, conceivably. What's
if we don't
next?
die in the process.
Yeah, right. I mean, so you've sweated bullets.
Yeah.
And you will have released the project. What's next? Or is it just taking a long nap?
Well, we're actually, no nap. This is why we're crazy. It's because then we're going on tour. The first 2.5 weeks of November, it'll be like a smaller tour, East Coast, Midwest. And then we'll be back and then we'll figure out the next thing.
Well, right. the next thing is getting rid of all buttons and and having a performance instruments that are, truly physical, playable instruments. So
are you going to go into lab yourself and design them, or are you going to try and collaborate with other people to develop these?
The instruments that we got from electrolobotomy have been just super inspiring in that there's a lot of creative possibility. I feel like with and there's already, I mean, we've already stuck Arduinos and other sensors in them.
So
I
control
think
freaks, I'm sure we will make them. Figure out some way to make them.
We'll long story short, we'll be making them.
Got it. I was going to say control freak and stress junkie is kind of like a good pairing.
Oh my God, this is terrible.
I'm sure we'll set a totally realistic deadline.
No doubt. Well, Ben, Christina, I thank you so much for taking the time. It's been really great and really fun to talk to y'all, and I look forward to hopefully getting a chance to see you guys perform soon.
For sure. Thanks so much.
No, thank you. It's an honor to be on the show. Thanks you for having us.
All right. Well, with that, I'll let you go on with the rest of your day. Thanks, and have a good one.
Hey, you too.
Many thanks to Ben and Christine for spending the time. As you can tell, it was a lot of fun talking to them. Very animated and fun people. They are about to do this tour, and they have just released this latest release. It's just come out, and so you should rush on over to their website. It's pretty easy to find if you can spell it. It's Ariadne, ariadnemusic.bandcamp.com, and that new release just dropped on Friday, so it's there for the pickings. Beyond that, I want to thank not only them, but thank you, the listeners, for showing up every week. It's really been great. We're coming up on number 200, and we got some special stuff coming up around that. So I want to thank you so much. And with that, I'll say goodbye until next week. Bye.